came back to awareness sprawled across a cold marble floor, the chandelier lights above me spinning like shattered constellations. A persistent ringing filled my ears, and the metallic taste of blood coated my tongue. Nearby, crystal glasses chimed against each other. A woman's voice pierced the air, calling out my name as though it belonged to someone else entirely. When I turned my head, a wave of agony crashed through me, and that's when I noticed it. A heavy brass centerpiece tumbling slowly across the floor, its surface staying dark. My father stood motionless nearby, chest heaving, eyes wild. 2 minutes before this moment, I had been completely composed, quietly declining a single request. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't made any threats. I had simply said no. And that one word had torn everything apart. I need to take you back, because nothing about that evening makes any sense without knowing who I was before I ever stepped through those venue doors. My name is Cheryl. I'm 30 years old and I work in construction. Not the polished, prestigious version people casually mention at dinner gatherings. The real kind, where your palms stay calloused regardless of how much you care for them, where you measure everything twice before cutting once, and where every mistake lands squarely on your own shoulders. People tend to react with surprise when I tell them what I do. Maybe it's because I don't fit whatever image they've already formed. I've made peace with that. I don't build things to earn anyone's admiration. I build because there's something deeply satisfying about knowing a structure will still be standing long after I've moved on. That drive came from my grandmother. She was the only person in my family who never treated ambition and hard work like something I'd eventually outgrow. When I was a child, she would sit at the kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a worn, chipped mug, watching me sketch tiny floor plans on paper napkins. She'd nod slowly and deliberately, then say, "If you're going to build something, make sure it can hold real weight." When she passed away, she left me a modest piece of land on the outskirts of the city. Nothing impressive at first glance. Uneven terrain, scraggly trees, the kind of lot everyone else passed over without a second thought. My parents called it impractical, a burden, a waste of time. I looked at it and saw the beginning of something permanent. For years, I worked full days and spent my nights and weekends on that property. I learned where every wire ran and which pipes connected to what. I knew which floorboard had a slight creak because I had driven the nail myself. When money got tight, I cut back on everything except the work. When I injured myself, I bandaged what I could and kept going. My family never once came to see the property, not once. In their eyes, my worth was always measured in comparison to my younger sister, Melissa. She was gentler, more expressive, and perpetually in need of rescuing. My parents circled her like she was the center of the solar system. I learned early on that being reliable made you invisible. So when Melissa announced her wedding, everyone framed it as a turning point, a celebration, a reason for the whole family to finally gather with joy. I should have trusted my instincts because families like mine don't gather for joy. They gather when they want something from you. The ceremony took place at one of those downtown event spaces that photographs beautifully but feels hollow in person. Soaring ceilings, white tablecloths, mirrors everywhere, every surface buffed to perfection. Everything arranged to project an image rather than create a feeling. I arrived by myself and immediately sensed the shift, the way guests glanced at my shoes and my hands before quietly looking elsewhere. I found my name card and followed it to a table near the far edge of the room. Not insulting exactly, but not close either. Far enough that the head table was a blur without leaning forward. Melissa, naturally, was luminous. She moved through the venue like she had been rehearsing for this moment her entire life. Her dress was flawless, her laughter infectious and carrying. My parents trailed behind her everywhere, adjusting small details, greeting guests, making sure the right people noticed what they had cultivated. Nobody introduced me as anything meaningful. When other guests asked what I did, my mother would smile stiffly and say, "Oh, Cheryl is very hands-on," as though it were a charming little quirk rather than a legitimate profession. An older aunt leaned over at one point and whispered, "That must be so exhausting," as if dedicating yourself to building something real were a kind of unfortunate affliction. I stayed pleasant. I always did. Dinner hadn't even been served when my father materialized beside me. Richard didn't sit down. He stood uncomfortably close, one hand resting on the back of my chair like he was assessing its structure. "Good crowd tonight," he said, scanning the room. "Big moment for us." "It is," I replied. My mother appeared seconds later, her smile already arranged. Elaine had this particular tone she deployed when a conversation was designed to sound warm but wasn't. "We need a quick word," she said. I felt it immediately, a pressure, almost physical, pressing between my shoulder blades. They didn't ask how I was doing. They didn't acknowledge my work or my life. They went directly to the point. Melissa was beginning a new chapter, my father explained. She needed something solid beneath her. My mother nodded. A real home, a foundation, and I already had one. I didn't respond immediately. I waited for them to continue. "There's an easy solution," my mother said. "You sign the house over to her, just on paper, really, more symbolic than anything. She and her husband will manage everything." My stomach dropped. I asked one question. "What happens to me?" They exchanged a look that communicated volumes, the kind of look that meant my question was irrelevant. "You're on your own," my father said plainly. "You don't need that much space. You'll figure something out." That was the moment something shifted inside me, quiet, clean, and permanent. They weren't requesting. They were redistributing. I looked across the ballroom at my sister laughing, at my parents beaming beside her, and I finally understood the truth I'd been sidestepping for years. To them, my house wasn't the product of years of sacrifice and discipline. It was simply a resource, and I was expected to relinquish it without hesitation or complaint. I hadn't refused yet, but in that moment, I knew without question that I was about to. They didn't allow me a moment to collect myself. My father leaned in closer, voice dropping, thick with certainty. "You'll do what's right," he said. "You always have." My mother's eyes took on that rehearsed softness that always resembled concern but functioned as coercion. "Think about your sister," she added. "This is what family does. You don't want to be responsible for ruining her day." The word ruining settled over me like something heavy. I glanced around, I saw crystal glasses, white arrangements, guests completely absorbed in their own conversations, entirely unaware that my livelihood was being treated like a line item on a balance sheet. I thought about the nights I slept in my car to stretch my savings further, the splinters embedded in my palms, the bruised knees, the quiet, private pride of turning my own key in my own door for the very first time. I looked back at them both. "I'm not signing my house over," I said. It wasn't loud. There was no performance in it, just steadiness. My mother's expression cracked first. "Don't make this difficult," she said under her breath. "We're asking you to help your family." My father's jaw set. "You're being selfish." "No," I replied, "I'm being honest." The temperature between us dropped sharply. "You wouldn't have any of it without us," he said. "Everything you have traces back to this family." I felt something solidify in my chest. "The land came from grandmother," I said. "The house came from me." Chairs nearby had begun shifting. Conversations had gone quiet. My sister was still on the dance floor, either unaware of what was unfolding or choosing not to see it. My mother's voice took on an edge. "If you leave this conversation the way you're planning to," she said, "don't expect things between us to stay the same." I understood precisely what she meant. The holidays, the birthdays, the pretense of belonging. I stood up. "I'm not giving my home away," I said. "Not tonight. Not ever." What followed was absolute silence, the kind that fills an entire room. I picked up my bag and turned to walk out. I remember the strange clarity of that moment, how no one moved to stop me, how steady my breathing was. I took 2 steps. Then I heard movement behind me, fast, deliberate. I turned just enough to see my father's expression shatter, something raw and uncontrolled breaking through the composed surface he'd always maintained in public. His hand closed around the brass centerpiece from the table behind him. There was no warning, no words, just the sound of something heavy cutting through air. Then everything went white. I returned to awareness in fragments. Sound came first. a sharp, jagged ringing that seemed trapped inside my head, refusing to stop. Then light, overwhelming and too white. My eyelids opened and closed against it. My body felt removed from me as though it were suspended slightly above where I actually lay. The floor. I slowly understood I was no longer standing. Cold marble pressed against my cheek. My shoulder burned from where it had struck first. When I attempted to move, nausea rose so quickly I had to hold completely still and breathe through it. Somewhere close by, a woman screamed my name. Someone else called for security. I tasted iron and understood without needing confirmation that I was bleeding. I turned my head slightly and saw it. The brass centerpiece rested on its side a few feet away. One curved edge darkened. It was far heavier than its decorative purpose suggested. The kind of object meant to project wealth and status, not serve as a weapon. It caught the ballroom light as it lay there, completely wrong on that polished floor, like a secret that had finally fallen into view. My father hadn't moved. Richard's breathing was visible, rapid and shallow, his eyes wide and unfocused. For a brief moment, he looked genuinely stunned, as though he couldn't fully process what he had just done. Then his gaze found me on the floor, and whatever uncertainty had existed vanished. "You don't walk away from me," he said, his voice cutting through the surrounding noise. "You don't turn your back on family." I tried to speak. Nothing came. A figure stepped between us. "Enough!" The voice wasn't raised, but it carried authority through the entire room. Daniel, Melissa's fiancé, positioned himself directly in front of me. He didn't reach for my father. He didn't gesture or shout. He simply stood there with his shoulders squared and his expression controlled, looking at Richard the way you'd look at something genuinely threatening that needed to be contained. "Step away from her," Daniel said. My father scoffed. "This isn't your concern." Daniel didn't move an inch. "It is now." Security personnel moved in quickly, one taking hold of my father's arm while another radioed for assistance. My mother hovered at the edges, wringing her hands, her expression not filled with fear for my safety, but rather with dread over the public spectacle being created. Someone called for an ambulance. As the paramedics guided me onto a stretcher, the room went soft around the edges. Lights streaked overhead. I caught a brief glimpse of Melissa standing frozen near the wedding cake, hands pressed over her mouth, eyes wide, not with worry, but with the shock of watching everything fall apart so publicly. The last thing I registered before the doors swung closed behind me was Daniel's voice again, measured and firm. "Don't touch her." This time it sounded less like a statement and more like a boundary being drawn permanently. I faded in and out while the paramedics worked. They asked my name, I answered. They asked what had happened. "My father hit me, but I said. Hearing those words in my own voice felt surreal, like narrating something that had happened to a stranger. By the time we reached the hospital, the adrenaline had fully burned away, leaving only pain. A deep, steady pressure settled behind my eyes that refused to ease. They stitched the laceration on my head and confirmed I had a concussion. I lay there staring at the ceiling, counting the faint lines in the tiles, trying not to think about the fact that my parents knew exactly where I was. The curtain shifted. My body tensed. But it wasn't them. It was Daniel. He looked like he had come through something difficult. His jacket gone, shirt creased, a faint smear of blood on one cuff. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the sight of me as if he needed confirmation that I was real and present and still here. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I should have stepped in earlier." I swallowed carefully. "You did enough." He pulled a chair close to the side of the bed and sat with his hands folded together, knuckles pale. "There are some things you need to know," he said. "Quite a few, actually." He laid it out slowly and deliberately, careful not to overwhelm me. Over the previous weeks, things had stopped adding up. Melissa had been evasive about finances. Payments she claimed were handled weren't. Bills were surfacing and then vanishing. He'd engaged someone to investigate quietly, just to be certain. What they uncovered was significant. He walked me through the debt, large sums with rounded figures that settled in my stomach uncomfortably. Credit accounts layered on top of each other, missed payments, balances shuffled between accounts to keep them concealed. And then he connected it to my house, and they weren't asking you to help her, Daniel said, his voice tight and controlled. They were planning to use your property to absorb everything, to make all of it disappear. I closed my eyes. Of course they were. And there's more, he continued. Your parents were aware of the situation. They've been helping her move things around quietly for some time. Something inside me went very still. I'm not going through with the wedding, he said. I ended it tonight. I opened my eyes and held his gaze. There was genuine anger there and disappointment, but underneath it something else entirely. Relief, maybe, that the truth had finally surfaced. None of this is because of you, he added, as though he could see exactly what I was turning over internally. They created this, not you. By the following morning, footage had already spread widely. Someone at the reception had captured the moment my father reached for the centerpiece. Another clip showed Daniel placing himself between us. The audio wasn't always clear, but the images required no narration. Security recordings filled in every remaining gap. By that afternoon, I'd missed calls from a detective, asking whether I wished to give a formal statement. By evening, my phone was full of messages from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, some checking on my well-being, others asking whether I had considered the implications of moving forward. My parents' messages were the most difficult to process. My mother pleaded with me to characterize it as an accident, to say he had stumbled, that everything had happened too quickly to understand. My father's message was brief. You provoked this. I didn't respond to either of them. Instead, I did something I had never truly allowed myself to do before. I trusted the process. I gave my statement clearly and completely. I submitted the footage and the evidence. I told the truth without embellishment, without seeking vengeance, without apology. The investigation moved forward with remarkable efficiency. The evidence was substantial. The witnesses were numerous. The story my parents had always relied on, that discomfort could be buried if everyone just stayed quiet, finally gave way under the reality of what had been documented. Weeks later, I sat in a courtroom with my hands resting in my lap, listening as the facts were presented methodically. The brass centerpiece was entered as evidence, the video footage was played. Financial records were referenced briefly, just enough to establish context and motive. My father didn't look at me once throughout the entire proceeding. When the judge spoke, her language was precise and deliberate. She addressed accountability. She addressed the boundary between parental expectation and ownership of another adult's life. The ruling carried no dramatic quality, no gasps, no outbursts, just consequences being applied where they belonged. And somehow that quiet, methodical finality carried more weight than any dramatic moment could have. As we filed out of the courtroom, Daniel caught my eye from across the room and gave me a single, understated nod. Not celebration, just acknowledgement. For the first time since the night everything broke open, I felt my body genuinely release the tension it had been holding. The weeks that followed moved at a different pace, slower, calmer, unfamiliar in the best possible way. My father's reputation contracted quickly. The professional standing he had built his entire sense of self around began to erode. Invitations stopped coming. My mother worked to patch things together using apologies that consistently stopped short of genuine accountability. Melissa went completely silent, retreating in a way that communicated more than any explanation she might have offered. I concentrated on recovering. The concussion lifted gradually. Some mornings the light still felt aggressive. Some nights the memory returned with unexpected sharpness. But every morning, I woke up inside the house I had built with my own hands, the one that now finally belonged to no one but me. Henry checked in regularly without ever pressing for details. He would simply appear with groceries or spare parts, or just quiet, uncomplicated company. One afternoon we stood together on the back deck and he said, "You already did the hardest part. You held your ground." The legal process concluded without spectacle. No dramatic 11th hour moments, just documentation, a ruling, and a boundary established where none had existed before. For the first time in my life, I wasn't anticipating the next demand or bracing myself for the next disappointment. I was simply living inside a life that felt entirely, unmistakably mine. And that, I came to understand, is what genuine resolution feels like once all the noise finally fades. A year on, I sit on my back steps as evening light falls across the walls I constructed myself. The house is quiet. There are no obligations being pressed on me, no guilt being leveraged, just room to exist. What I lost that night wasn't really a family in the truest sense. What I found were my own limits, clearly drawn at last. And I learned that genuine love doesn't require you to make yourself smaller so someone else can appear larger. If you've ever had to protect yourself from the very people who should have protected you, share your story below and subscribe so you're there for what comes next.